Hey, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 8, Sleep and Biological Rhythms. The first topic we're covering is the sleep cycle. Before we get too far into it, let's talk about what sleep is and why we do it. As you might be able to fill in for yourself, sleep is characterized by the absence of conscious behavior. During sleep, we have a higher threshold for arousal by external stimuli, meaning it's harder for us to notice or to pay attention to things in our immediate surroundings. There's not a hard number for how much sleep we need to function, but about 8 hours is optimal for most people, give or take. People spend over 175,000 hours in the average lifetime sleeping. Of course, about 1/3 of your lifespan if you're spending 8 hours a day asleep. The huge amount of time we spend sleeping suggests that it must have some sort of very important biological function. Let's talk a little bit about what that function might be. So, why might we spend so much time in a weird, unconscious state every day? Well, there's the recuperation idea that sleep is needed to restore homeostasis, right, to keep things at about the place our body wants them to be. And wakefulness, by nature of being around, being awake, and expending resources, causes a deviation from our homeostasis, right? We put ourselves into a different sort of worn out state from doing things all day. Sleeping helps us to recuperate. There are also adaptation theories that sleep is the result of an internal timing mechanism, so our internal sort of biological clock. Sleep has potentially evolved to help us to be protected from the dangers of the night, right? We're diurnal animals. We like to stay awake during the day. We don't see so well at night. So it makes sense that we might have a sort of adaptation built in to keep us out of danger and put us in a safe place to rest during the time when we can't see potential predators. So it might be tempting to think of sleep as sort of an absence of anything, right? Not really much to measure the person's asleep. But sleep, as it turns out, is a measurable behavior. We use EEG most often to measure activity during sleep. This will let us pick up on neural oscillations. Neural oscillations are basically just rhythmic firing of groups of neurons that we can measure really easily with EEG. Tell us a little bit about what's happening during sleep. Electromyogram, or EMG, can measure muscle activity. We'll talk a bit more later on about how muscle tone changes throughout sleep. So muscle tone can be a valuable piece of information as to what stage of sleep someone is in. Electroocculogram is EOG. It's what it sounds like. It measures eye movements. So what are we looking at with EEG? EEG records the excitation of many neurons in the cerebral cortex. Remember, EEG cannot penetrate the cortex and measure activity at deeper brain regions, but it does a great job of measuring activity in the cortex. So we can tell a couple of things from this signal. Basically, if you remember back to our discussion of action potentials, the firing of neurons causes changes in ion concentrations, right? Ions move from the extracellular fluid into the neurons and from neurons into the extracellular fluid. That disruption in those charged particles creates this sort of wave of electrical signal that can be picked up from scalp electrodes. So as there are changes that are taking place resulting from neural firing, we can pick up evidence of that neural firing. So EEGs let us look at groups of neurons firing at the same time. If we have a high amplitude signal, meaning the waves are large, that means lots of neurons are firing at once. We see a bigger change. If we see a high frequency waveform where the peaks of the waves are close together, that means the neurons are firing quickly, right? So high amplitude, many neurons firing at once. High frequency, neurons firing quickly. So to hit this sort of again in a different way, neural oscillations are sinusoidal, sort of regular waves. These reflect the flow of current through cellular membranes, right? So when neurons are having action potentials or becoming polarized or depolarized, there's current moving through membranes, which we can measure with this. This bears a close relationship to neuronal firing because to have action potentials, you need a large amount of ion exchange. We have different bands based on frequency. So we'll talk about some of those coming up, but things like alpha, beta, theta waves are bands of frequency. And what we mean by bands of frequency is just sort of categories based on how quickly the neurons are firing, right? How many times we're having neurons firing during a given period of time. You can see here we have a graph that's depicting individual neurons, right? So these are every little perpendicular line you see here is firing of an action potential. So we have 6 neurons represented in this graph here, and you can see as we get all these little squiggly lines, those are electrical events in those neurons. Up here, we have cortical EEG. So this is what we might see as a result of all of these neurons firing, right? We see a spike in all of these neurons firing. We see large amplitude waveforms, right? As we see troughs where there aren't so many neurons firing, we see a dip in the waveform. When you see really rapid firing of neurons, you see high frequency bits in the band. And when it's slower, we see low frequency. So basically, cortical EEG is meant to be an averaged representation of a lot of different neurons in the cortex firing around the same time. So let's talk a little bit more about those oscillations and what they tell us in terms of sleep stage. So first off, we have alpha. The alpha band is smooth 8 to 12 hertz oscillations. So fast, right? 8 to 12 hertz means it's happening relatively quickly. So hertz is basically cycles per second when you're looking at some kind of a periodic function. So 8 to 12 hertz means we have 8 to 12 events happening per second. So it's pretty fast. You can see here the lines are really spiky and close together. This is often associated with relaxation. So if you're in sort of a quiet state, relaxing a little bit, we'll probably see a lot of alpha activity. Whereas by contrast, beta activity is a regular 13 to 30 hertz oscillation, so quite a bit faster and less smooth and rhythmic looking. So here's beta activity. Right here, you can see the difference. That's much more frequent and sort of much more jagged and irregular looking. This is generally associated with a state of arousal. So when you're up and doing stuff and paying attention and engaging, we're more likely to see beta activity. All right, now talking about our sleep cycles. As you progress through the night, you move through a number of different stages of sleep that we can describe here. So stage 1 is theta oscillations. This is 3.5 to 7.5 hertz. And frequency, and this is the transition between wakefulness and sleep. So here's what your activity might look like when you're awake, alpha and beta activity. Stage 1 sleep, you see a nice slowing down, high amplitude, slower waveforms. Stage 1 sleep is that stage where you're kind of transitioning into sleep. If, for example, you're in class and you've had a long night and you start to nod off a little bit, you'll drop into stage 1 sleep briefly during class. So you're still kind of aware of your surroundings, but you're definitely not completely conscious. Stage 2 is a little bit deeper. This is marked by irregular neural activity. We see a lot of theta in stage 2. The thing that sets stage 2 apart from stage 1 is these odd little waveforms that take place during stage 2 sleep. We see sleep spindles, which are short bursts of 12 to 14 hertz activity. So much faster neural oscillations than we see during stage 2 sleep. So it looks briefly like alpha or maybe even beta wave activity for just a moment. So we see right here a really fast burst of firing, then back to normal theta. We also see K complexes, which are these big spiky waveforms here, sudden sharp waves. So these things are thought to be important for memory consolidation, which is in fact the subject of the paper that you're reading this week. Okay, now we're on to talking about slow wave sleep. Depending what source you're looking at, you can conceptualize stage 3 and stage 4 as either separate or just part of the same general category of sleep. So stage 3, to stay consistent here, we're talking about stage 3 as being distinct from stage 4, but lumping stage 3 and stage 4 together into just calling it stage 3 or calling it slow wave sleep is generally acceptable. So in stage 3, we see delta oscillations, which are slower than 3.5 hertz. You can see here, this is delta activity. So 20 to 50% of the overall oscillation should be delta here, whereas if we qualify this as stage 4 sleep, we want to see more than 50% of the oscillations being delta to be stage 4. Again, we often lump in stage 3 and stage 4 because they're very similar. But you see here, during the stage 3 sleep, we see some delta activity mixed in with theta, and in stage 4, we're seeing lots of delta activity. Delta being slower than 3.5 hertz, nice, big, slow waves. That's stage 4 sleep. So with slow wave sleep, as I mentioned, we see these really, really slow oscillations, sometimes less than 1 hertz, meaning on average, less than 1 cycle per second. So that's really slow for our neurons. They're not typically firing so slowly. So we can see a down state where there's a lack of firing in neocortex neurons. So we see something like right here, where there's a gap, not a whole lot of activity happening. This may be a period of important rest for our cells. And then on the up state, we see a period of high firing of neocortex neurons. So we see sort of this slow oscillatory activity where we have spiking of neurons, then a rest period, then spiking of neurons, and a rest period, which translates into big peaks and valleys on our EEG. All right, next up, we're going to talk about the coolest and weirdest thing we do while we're asleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. This is marked by rapid sawtooth brain activity that resembles waking activity. So our REM sleep has theta and beta activity and often looks a lot like a waking person's sleep. We see lots of stuff happening here that's a clear marker of it. We see increased breathing and heart rate relative to deep sleep, momentary bursts of eye movement every 30 seconds or so. So we'll see sort of moving of the eyes back and forth. That hence the name rapid eye movement. Dreaming also generally takes place during REM sleep. We also see a lack of muscle tone as the sort of REM-related sleep paralysis sets in. So we see a drop in muscle tone on our EMGs, increase in activity on our measures of eye activity, increased breathing and heart rate, and this rapid waking-like brain activity. So to sort of talk about that again in a different way, we have a sleep cycle that's about 90 minutes in duration from start to finish. And I'll show you a graph in just a minute of how that progression works. And again, that rapid eye movement period of sleep is marked by regular activity, so the theta and beta activity, rapid lateral movement of the eyes, and a lack of muscle tone, so essentially paralysis. So typically in a healthy person, how sleep is going to work is we're going to move from basically wakefulness down to stage 1, stage 2, 3, 4, down into deep sleep, and then back up again. And at the top of our sleep cycle, we'll drift into REM sleep for a while. So we start awake, drop down deeper and deeper into sleep, then come up to lighter sleep, into REM sleep, which is of course distinct from pretty much anything else. Then after the REM sleep period is over, we drop back into stage 2, 3, back down. And we sort of cycle through that as the night goes. Though it's not uniform throughout the course of the night, right? As you can see here in this graph, you start by spending more time in slow wave sleep, so you drop all the way down to slow wave sleep, and you dip back up and go into REM sleep, then you're back down, then you're back up, and then you're back down. But after you've been asleep for a few hours, you spend less time in slow wave sleep, and you're spending more and more time in REM sleep and in shallow states of sleep. So if you ever had the experience of being in a really deep sleep and then a loud noise or something, or if you're like me and you have a cat that likes to make noise at night and you just suddenly get jolted awake, if you wake up in stage 4 sleep, you wake up feeling groggy and you're very unlikely to report having just been dreaming. You just sort of wake up and it's that weird, awful feeling where you're like, whoa, where am I? What's happening? As you sort of slowly ramp your neural activity back up and make sense of what's happening, it's really hard to wake up and get going. However, if you wake up from REM sleep, you're typically more alert. It doesn't feel as jarring to be woken up from a shallow stage of sleep or from REM sleep. People who are woken up from REM sleep, if you ask them, will often report that they were dreaming. Deep sleep's more common early, as I mentioned, and REM becomes more common later on. So you're spending more time in REM sleep later on in the night, spending more time in deep sleep early in the night. All right, so finally, during REM sleep, most of your spinal and cranial motor neurons are inhibited. This leads to sort of a paralysis state. That's generally a good thing. You don't want to be acting out your dreams and thrashing around and doing stuff in response to your dreams. That can be dangerous, in fact. REM behavior disorder is a rare disorder where this doesn't happen and people act out their dreams, and it's usually a bit of a disaster. Also during REM sleep, we see increased blood flow and oxygen consumption in the brain, so the person looks a lot more like an awake person in terms of all of the activity that's going on. It's a very high activity time. In addition, we see genital arousal during REM sleep. This is not necessarily caused by sexual dreams. This is just a totally normal thing that happens and doesn't really indicate anything beyond that you're in REM sleep. This can be used as a way to assess potential causes of impotence, as if it's more of a stress or psychologically related thing versus a physiological cause. Okay, that's it for our discussion of the sleep cycle. I'll see you next time.